Chapter 10 of The Secret of Shadow Ranch. This chapter is called Hidden Entrance. "I just can't believe it," Nancy exclaimed. "No one could have come out. I could see the door all the while I was running toward it." Ed Raleigh looked at Nancy. "I'm sure you didn't imagine seeing the light. This worries me." Nancy told him of the similar experience she had had the day before. "Perhaps there's a secret exit," she said. Using her flashlight, Nancy examined the walls of the spring house, but they were solid adobe. It occurred to her that there might be a wooden trapdoor and a passageway under the earthen floor. She looked for any sign of seams in the earth. There were none. Nancy gave a baffled sigh and glanced at the stone vat. "No use bothering with that," said Mr. Raleigh. "It's too small to hide in and too heavy to be moved in a hurry. Whoever escapes from here does it in a twinkling." As Nancy and the rancher left the spring house, she gazed uneasily toward the meadow. "The last time I saw the light, the phantom horse appeared out there," she said. "I'll alert my men to watch for more sabotage," Uncle Ed said quickly. "And I'll take one off patrol duty to stand guard here at the spring house all night." He hurried away. Nancy stood watching the dark meadow, puzzling over the problem of the disappearing light. The phantom horse did not appear, and finally she returned to the house. Nancy went to the living room, lighted a lamp, and sat down alone to think over the mystery. How could someone disappear from the spring house without using the exit? Suddenly she remembered that a prowler had done the same thing from the cellar of the house. Nancy jumped up excitedly. "Of course, that's the answer," she told herself. "The spring house is next to the kitchen, and the cellar is under it. There must be a hidden passage from one to the other." She hastened out of the house and around the corner, but stopped short. A shadowy figure was lounging outside the spring house. It was Dave on guard. Nancy decided against examining the spring house again that night. On the way back, she glanced into the kitchen. Mrs. Thurmond was seated at the big table reading a magazine. Next to her was Bud Moore. He saw Nancy at the door. "Howdy," he said. "Mr. Raleigh changed me into a house guard tonight, so you girls could sleep easy." "That's great, thanks." Nancy smiled, but inwardly she was disappointed. "Now I can't investigate the cellar either," she thought, with Bud around. Nancy awoke at dawn. She dressed quickly and slipped out of the house. To her relief, there was no longer anyone on guard at the spring house. She stepped inside and walked to the kitchen wall. Nancy lifted the vat and looked in. It was empty. Nancy knelt and began to feel the bottom of the vat. Along the front edge, her fingers suddenly encountered a piece of cord, and opposite, another piece. Nancy pulled on them, and the bottom moved. As she yanked harder, the floor of the vat lifted a few inches. It was made of wood, which had been covered with gray plaster to look like stone. Before Nancy could lift it higher, she heard footsteps outside. Quickly, she dropped the bottom and closed the vat. She had just time to grab a tin cup and hold it under the stream of water before the wooden door opened. Nancy turned and saw Shorty standing there. For a moment, he was speechless with surprise. "Wow," he exclaimed. "You're sure up mighty early, miss." "Yes, I am," Nancy said with a smile, then excused herself and left the spring house. As she strolled off, she could feel Shorty's eyes on her. Nancy knew that the ranch hands rose early. Did Shorty intend to get a drink of water? Or did he see me go in and come to find out what I was doing? Excited by her discovery in the spring house, Nancy could hardly wait for her friends to awaken so she could tell them about it. At the news, George sat up straight in bed. "That's something," she exclaimed. "You found the secret entrance to the cellar." "I think so," Nancy replied. "It was still kind of dark, and I raised the bottom only a few inches. There might just be a hidden compartment under the false floor. Let's not tell anyone till we're sure." Bess said, Good idea. The girls dressed in jeans and shirts, hoping to investigate the mysterious vat very soon, but at breakfast, Foreman Sanders ruined the plan. 2 of the men will be working on the pump most of the day, he announced. It hasn't been right since the damage was done. Before the meal was over, Nancy asked with a smile, "Who locked me in the tack room last night by mistake?" There was silence in the kitchen. Nancy learned nothing. No one wore a guilty expression. In mid-morning, Mr. Raleigh asked the 4 girls if they would like to go with him to Tumbleweed. They all accepted eagerly, and piled into the ranch wagon with Dave at the wheel. On the way, Uncle Ed told them he was going to the stockyards to pick up a dozen fine palominos for breeding. That's a kind of blonde horse. He had ordered and paid for the horses some time before. "It's a big investment," he frowned. "I just hope nothing happens to them." Dave drove straight through town and parked on the outskirts in front of the stockyards. As Nancy got out of the car, she noticed a sign on the fence. "Tumbleweed Rodeo, Barbecue and Square Dance, Saturday." Dave called her aside. "Will you go to the barbecue and square dance with me?" Surprised, Nancy hesitated for a moment. "Please do," he added earnestly. "Bess and George promised Tex and Bud they would go. We can make it a triple date." "Okay, thank you," she replied. "Good," he said, then excused himself and hurried into the stockyard after Uncle Ed. Meanwhile, the girls walked around the enclosures looking at the animals. The visitors were attracted to a small corral where a man was offering trained horses for sale. The girls walked to the fence and joined the cowboys and ranchers who were watching a little chestnut mare perform. Her master stood in the center of the ring and gave various whistles. In response, the horse pranced, reared, and kneeled. At the final whistle, the mare ran to him and took a piece of sugar from his hand. "Isn't she darling?" Bess murmured. As the girls strolled away, they saw Dave near one of the horse enclosures. Nancy asked him if she had time to take Bess, George, and Alice to Mary Deer's shop. "Sure," he replied. "Go ahead. We'll pick you up there in the ranch wagon." The girls walked down Main Street and turned into the gift shop. A tall man was standing at the counter talking to Mary. As he turned around, Nancy stopped short in surprise. He was the man in black she had seen near the shop after the attempted robbery. Mary greeted the girls warmly, and Nancy introduced Bess, George, and Alice. The Indian girl presented the tall man as Mr. Diamond, one of her best customers. He smiled at Nancy smoothly. "Miss Drew, I congratulate you. Mary tells me that she has given you that pretty little antique watch I've had my eye on. For weeks she has been refusing to sell it to me." Mary spoke up. "I told Mr. Diamond the history of Valentine and his treasure," she said. "Ever since then he has been most eager to have Francis Humber's watch." Mr. Diamond gave a deep chuckle. "I like to collect mementos of the romantic Old West." "Do you live around here?" George asked. "No, ma'am. I'm spending the summer in this area for my health, staying at the Tumbleweed Hotel." Mary smiled. "Mr. Diamond spends most of his days riding horseback in the mountains for exercise." Nancy's thoughts went to the man in the black hat she had glimpsed in the ghost town, the one who perhaps had caused the rock slide. Had it been Mr. Diamond? Nancy thought it possible because of his knowledge of the treasure. After chatting for a few minutes, Mr. Diamond said, "Well, goodbye now, girls," and left the shop. While the others selected a few souvenirs, Nancy took Mary aside and asked her if she had heard from the artist, Mr. Bursey. When Nancy said no, Nancy added, "If you do, please phone me right away." Mary promised that she would. Dave pulled up in the wagon, so the girls hurriedly paid for their purchases and left. "The horses are going to be delivered this afternoon," Uncle Ed said with satisfaction as they drove back to the ranch. "They're first-rate animals." The ranch wagon arrived home just as Mrs. Thurman was ringing the triangle for lunch. Nancy wondered how she would endure the long afternoon waiting for darkness so she could investigate the vat in the spring house. Her attention distracted, however, by Van's bringing the new horses. The girls and Aunt Bet went outside and watched the men run the palominos into the big meadow. Nancy hurried to the fence for a closer look. "Oh, they're just beautiful," she cried out. Dave, who was on horseback beside the meadow gate, agreed. "They're just the way they should be, the color of a new minted gold coin." The last one, a little mare, trotted into the enclosure. Dave wheeled beside her and headed the pony out to the fence. "Want to pet her?" he asked Nancy. With a smile, Nancy stroked the sleek nose of the palomino. The mare nickered and shook her head. Dave laughed. "Okay, little lady," he said, "on your way." He slapped the pony on the rump, and she ran off to join the others. With a wave at Nancy, Dave rode off. She admired the competent way he did his job, and his kind, firm manner with the animals. "I hope he's not mixed up in this mystery," she sighed. As soon as it was dusk, Nancy hurried to the stable and saddled her mount in case the phantom horse should appear that night. Then she asked Bess and George to join her and investigate the spring house. Bess inquired if they were going to take Alice along. "She's writing letters in her room," George said. Not knowing exactly what lay ahead of them, Nancy thought it wise to leave the younger girl behind. When it was dark, she took her flashlight and the three girls hastened to the spring house. They went inside and closed the door. Nancy turned on her light, raised the vat lid, and with heart thumping, pulled up the false bottom. A deep hole slanted downward. While George held the light, Nancy lowered herself into it and felt her foot touch something solid. She kicked lightly, and a wood panel moved. In a few moments, she dropped onto an earthen floor. She was in the cellar. Through the hole came Bess. She landed with a thud. From above came the noise of the vat lid closing. A moment later, George appeared in the cellar with her flashlight turned off. For a moment they stood listening. A shiver ran up Nancy's spine. She thought she could hear someone breathing in the darkness. Quietly, Nancy took the flashlight from George and turned it on. The sweeping beam caught a crouching figure in the corner. Dave Gregory. And that's the end of chapter 10.